sauerkraut, pickle, natto, kimchi. These are foods that throughout history have been used for various health benefits. They can promote a healthier dopamine system that leads people to pursue healthier foods.
To see what is in a bottle of kombucha blew my mind and convinced me that these fermented products are potentially superfoods.
Dr. William Davis, who introduced me to this recipe, has seen eradication of SIBO by consuming a cup of this yogurt over a 4-week period of time.
Vinegar, it turns out, if you have a tablespoon of it in some water before a meal, you can reduce the glucose spike of that meal by up to 30%.
Gut microbiome, we have a lot of species of little microbes living in our gut, which sounds gross, but they actually, if they are the right ones, they really help us. So much so that people who are obese versus people that are lean, if they swap their microbiota, they actually can do this. They can swap which sorts of little microbiota are living in the gut. Then people who are heavy get lean. And so you go, well, and they tend to crave healthier foods. So this is really interesting. And what it shows is that the gut is talking to the brain in a way that is below our conscious detection. I know this sounds crazy, but there's tons of data to support this now. One of the things that's very actionable that work at Stanford in the Sonnenberg lab has been shown to benefit this whole system is to keep a healthy gut microbiome. And the best way to do that, turns out, is not to take probiotics, which, by the way, are very expensive and often have the wrong species of probiotic in there, wrong bacteria, but rather to eat 2 to 4 servings of low sugar fermented food per day. So sauerkraut, pickles, not the ones loaded with sugar, but natto, kimchi. These are foods that throughout history have been used for various health benefits. So they tend to lower inflammation. This has now been well established. Lower inflammation, which is good for the brain and body. They can promote healthier eating. They can promote a healthier dopamine system, so to speak, that leads people to pursue healthier foods. So obviously there are people are overeating, but part of the reason they're overeating is not even their own bad conscious choices, is that their brain has been tricked into overeating. And so I think there's the physical exercise component, of course, but I think that we need to acknowledge that the system, now I really sound like, the system with respect to processed foods is definitely rigged. And there's a whole thing around this that makes financial sense for, and I don't think conspiracy here, it's when foods can spoil on the shelf, they can't be listed as a commodity. And so there's a huge financial upside for being able to create foods that can have a long shelf life and that are loaded, therefore loaded with emulsifiers and disrupt the gut microbiome. There's a huge incentive for putting so-called hidden sugars into foods, even hidden false sugars like saccharin into foods, not to lower the caloric count, but because that actually can trigger these mechanisms, these bad mechanisms too. So I think we need to acknowledge that the number one thing that all of us can do is create a healthy gut microbiome. Well, there are 3 things. One is recognize that there are these subconscious things, that what you think you're eating, it might not actually be what you're eating, and that it's changing your appetite. So that raises the second thing, which is most people should probably try and eat whole foods. So if eating foods that you prepare and then in non-processed foods. And then the other one is basically to create a healthy gut microbiome through the ingestion of 2 to 4 servings of fermented foods, which isn't much. It's a few spoonfuls of sauerkraut or a pickle, once or twice a day. Most of these foods are pretty tasty anyway, but most of us aren't consuming enough of those foods. And I think that the 2 to 4 servings of fermented food per day, I think one reason I like that recommendation is the science points to it as beneficial. And also it's something to do as opposed to something to not do. I mean, there's a lot of restrictive practices that are associated with losing weight, et cetera. And those are hard because they're restrictive. But the addition of something that hopefully, I think most people like some form of fermented, low sugar fermented food. The gut microbiome is so fascinating, and it's an area that you can just think of part of you. It's like a little community that talks to the neurons that talk to your brain and really control your appetite. Some people start eating fermented foods and they lose their appetite for really sugary carbohydrate type foods. They just lose it completely. They just, for whatever reason, they don't crave that stuff anymore. And it's remarkable, but it makes sense. And I mean, the microbiome is involved in so many things. I think it's sleep being the fundamental layer of health, and all the light and stuff that goes with it. But I think that the gut microbiome is right up there in the top 5 or so of critical aspects of our body that we all absolutely need to take care of.
Every culture does have some fermentation process that is kind of a staple, or was a staple at one point. And from an anthropological standpoint, it's pretty fascinating. And there's, fermentation's an excellent preservative, can keep things for a long time. So there are reasons for that, how it developed in part for those purposes. But fermented foods are going through a huge renaissance right now. And during the pandemic, people were fermenting everything, pickling everything, creating, it was a thing to do. Sourdough bread's a fermented food to a degree. And you couldn't find yeast anywhere during the pandemic either. So there's definitely a movement in fermented foods, which I support wholly. I think fermented foods are an excellent food source to support the gut microbiome. But why I think they're an important food source is not because they have live bugs in them, which most of them still do have live cultures in them. It's because that it's kind of a living food. And in the process, I talked about that the gut bacteria are making all these metabolites, all these chemicals that go to the rest of the body. Well, your fermented food is laden with those chemicals because the bugs are in there fermenting, doing their fermented things. And if you were to do a mass spec analysis of the liquid fraction of kombucha, it would be thousands of chemicals in it. And we've actually done this analysis with actually UCLA did it as part of a project that I was involved in. And so to see what is in a bottle of kombucha blew my mind and convinced me that these fermented products are potentially superfoods. They all have, it's unregulated. We don't know what the concentrations are. Every food is made kind of wildly, some batch to batch variation, things like that. But what is the postbiotics is what we call them, the chemicals produced by the bugs, have major bioactive effects, that we have only scratched the surface of. So fermented foods, awesome, take them. There's really no downside to taking fermented foods unless you have some functional GI issues. Sometimes if you have IBS, you might be sensitive to fermented foods. But otherwise, eat them. Pick your favorite fermented food in your cuisine and just go for it.
That is a paradigm shifter right there. It's not necessarily just the probiotics that is what we're focusing on. It's what they're making.
Yeah.
These postbiotics, which goes back to what you started with, the things they're making in us for us, and what we can get from these fermented foods and beverages.
Yeah.
And also with the fermented food, or like a vegetable, for example, we're getting a prebiotic kind of substrate as well that could potentially be helpful for other microbes that are not in that food.
Yeah, you're getting the whole thing, Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
There's a lot that you can learn from the Blue Zones data. The thing I like about it is that because you're spreading the observations around the planet from Loma Linda to Sardinia to Nicoya to Okinawa, you're seeing a less myopic focus on low carb, high fat, high carb, low fat, vegan, paleo, carnivore, whatever, even though it does seem to be skewed a little bit towards plant-based diets as far as being the champion of a lot of these Blue Zones, which is interesting because if you look at the actual data, there is a pretty high consumption of everything from meat, particularly fermented meat products, fish, eggs, grass-fed, grass-finished meat. Fermented dairy is huge in a lot of these cultures. And so I'm not sure if it's, politically driven or what, but I think that there is sometimes a little bit of an impression that people get that you got to eat vegan or plant-based to be one of the Blue Zones. And the fact is they are eating meat and dairy-based products, but they're far different than a Beyond Burger or a Big Mac. Like we're talking about fermentation and dry aging and wet aging and, and dairy from naturally raised animals, and even the consumption of a high amount of organ meats, rich in life extending glycine versus the potentially, age accelerating amino acid methionine. And so there's a lot there, but when you step back and look at common characteristics of the Blue Zones, you do see things that no matter what diet you eat are going to pop up over and over again. For example, a high intake of a wide variety of herbs and spices and even plants, right? Not a strict plant-based diet, but eating sometimes over 100 different varietals. Diversity. So the amount of polyphenols and flavonols and even so-called plant defense mechanisms that you're getting exposed to in small amounts on a regular basis to induce cellular resilience, you see that. There are some people who think that many of these populations live long despite their grain intake, not because of it. When you step back and look at the polyphenol content, even some of the hormetic compounds, some of the nutrient density in properly prepared grains, I do think they offer an advantage. And there are some super grains out there. For example, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, the father of functional medicine, now raises a grain called Himalayan tartary buckwheat. It's one of the only flours that we now cook with because it's so nutrient dense. It's naturally gluten-free, has less of the concentrated cellular defense, plant defense mechanisms in it. And it's a fantastic grain. You know, we use a lot of Palouse red wheat too, which is kind of like an ancient grain, like einkorn. And when I use terms like ancient grains, that means many of them have not been bred for high yield crop or genetically modified, meaning they're less capable of irritating the gut and they're less concentrated in lectins, like gluten, for example. So the source of the grain that you're fermenting is important. But fermentation in general it's an old school method of preparing food in a manner that pre-digests the food, that unlocks nutrients, and that even in some cases concentrates bacteria that are beneficial to the gut. So I've been making yogurt for the past 3 years on my counter. You can use a yogurt maker. You can use a food dehydrator. In a pinch, you can use an oven on a very low setting. And it simply involves, and in my case, I like coconut milk. I don't do that well with dairy. We have goats. I do okay having some of the goat milk and goat yogurt every once in a while, but I do better with coconut milk. So I use coconut milk. I use these little tablets from Amazon called BioGaia. It's a Lactobacillus reuteri. And I crush those up and I put it into the milk. And then I add a little bit of sugar and I put that in a food dehydrator or yogurt maker for about 36 hours. When it finishes, I stir in gelatin to make it really thick, like Jell-O. And I always have a batch of yogurt. And there's, you go to Erewhon, you pay like $30 for a mason glass jar of like really high-end coconut yogurt or goat's milk yogurt or whatever. I'm making this for less than $1 for an equivalent batch at home. So I constantly have a batch of yogurt going, and amazing studies on this L. reuteri strain. For example, real culprit for gas and bloating in a lot of people is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO. And Dr. William Davis, who introduced me to this recipe, has seen eradication of SIBO by consuming a cup of this yogurt over a 4-week period of time. Helps you sleep better, helps produce oxytocin. That's one example. I also make water kefir, which gives you nice, beautiful, slippery poops every morning, and it's fantastic for the gut, and it can be used as a cocktail alternative in the evening. I got dirt cheap water kefir grains from a company called Cultures for Health. Only have to buy them once, because as long as you don't let them die, you can just keep your batch going over and over again. And they grow like chia pets. You can give them away to friends. All I do for my water kefir is I have a really big mason glass jar on the counter, and I put my water kefir grains into it. And then I like to use coconut water. Some recipes call for water and sugar, but I find the composition of coconut water, not only does it have a good enough amount of sugar to feed the water kefir, but I like the flavor. It's like a richer, creamier flavor. So I use this Once Upon a Coconut company because their cans are lower in BPA, and they also do these they have larger plastic containers as well. And I do about 5 cans of that in the glass jar over the water kefir grains, keep that on the kitchen counter for 48 hours until when I stir with a spatula and put my ear to it, it's nice and fizzy. If I leave it out longer for that, I'll get a little alcoholic. So you have a fun time with your kefir if you leave it out for too long. But I like about 48 hours. And then I strain the kefir grains out and I put them in a little sugar water in the fridge to save them for the next batch. And I put the water kefir in the fridge. And that's the equivalent of about 4 of the $6.99 bottles of water kefir you get at Whole Foods or whatever. But that's like a quarter for me to make all of that. Maybe a little bit more if you're using coconut water, but it's not that expensive. So that's another example. And then you can also use milk kefir. You're doing exactly what I just described, but you use milk kefir grains in like goat milk or cow milk instead of water or coconut water. I like to use that as a meat marinade. It also really makes eating organ meats taste fantastic. If you want to make like crispy, like some of the best like Southern style fried chicken you've ever had, you actually soak the chicken in kefir for 24 hours and then take it out and shake it up in the paper bag with the egg and the flour and everything. And it just makes the chicken taste amazing because the kefir enzymatically degrades some of the chicken, draws some of the gamey flavor out, makes the inside moist, the outside crispy. And then finally, there's the sourdough bread, which is, the process of sourdough fermentation actually pre-digests a lot of the gluten, breaks down a lot of the phytic acids and enzyme inhibitors that are in a grain, and you get this nice, crispy, chewy, gut-friendly bread that a lot of people who have gluten issues tend to digest a lot better. If you have celiac disease, you still can't eat grains. It's just how you're genetically hardwired. But the sourdough process of fermentation makes bread way healthier. And oh my gosh, when like my wife makes a new batch of sourdough bread twice a week, and I just slather that thing with like bone marrow and honey and sea salt and use it as like a delivery portal for olive oil and squash and soups. And it's some of the best stuff ever. I will literally have like sourdough bread with a bunch of honey and peanut butter and salt on it for dessert. I mean, it's amazing.
If you expose people early on to these healthy foods, they will adapt. May start at a different point, but nearly everyone can adapt. And I'm a big fan of kimchi, the Korean spicy cabbage. And most Americans, wouldn't immediately say, "Oh yes, kimchi for breakfast, that's great." And there's a huge variety about whether they like all that spiciness or the chili or whatever. But every Korean kid gets given kimchi as soon as they're weaning, and they spit it out a couple of times. It's a big thing in Korea. They show these photos of the little babies spitting out their first kimchi, but they keep giving it, and in the end, they all love it. So I think, although we've got this big diversity, we can train everyone to eat, in a healthy way. We don't have to immediately say, "Oh, let's just give them baby food and this rubbish." And we shouldn't have children's menus. They should start to learn early age, what good food tastes like.
The kimchi rite of passage.
Yeah, well, perhaps we should all start, doing the same thing, because they've got something right. They're about the only sort of rapidly developed country that is stayed healthy and is not obese, and because they've kept this food culture going. And this amazing culture of having kimchi at virtually all their meals, which is a probiotic. And, we'll talk about it because it's prebiotic and probiotic. It's full of microbes. Yeah. And it also preserves their food culture. So really important at all levels, and gets kids very early on to be able to taste bitter and sour and spicy food. That steers them away from that sort of sweet, gooey, dairy flavors that we've gone for in the West. Just keeping kids on breast milk for life, essentially.
Yeah, there is something remarkable that happens with that fermentation process. I actually noted a study in my last book, Eat Smarter. They had test subjects to consume either the kimchi, the fermented version, or the ingredients that hadn't been fermented, the cabbage and the radish, the carrot, whatever the case might be. And it was so fascinating that there was a significant improvement in metabolic health when they were given the fermented version. There's something about those microbes and that interaction with our cells, our human cells, that it really points to the fact that this is something that we need. And when I used to work at the university gym, I would ask people, I was after a couple of years, but because I'm working at a university, I'm working with people from all over the world. And eventually I started asking people, like, what kind of fermented food do you have in your culture? And every culture had cultured foods, every single one, right? And even the word culture is there. And I thought that was so fascinating, And
what do the Americans have?
Pizza rolls, So yeah, that's the thing. And if we can start to borrow, because we're all, America's known as this melting pot, and start to borrow from traditions that have interacted and or are our relatives, you know, our close ancestors. That's one of the ways I found much more success with helping people to get well. It wasn't having them do what I think they should do, but what's your lineage? You know, if you're from this particular region in Kenya or Nairobi and your ancestors were eating goat, you know, nyama and, you know, chapati, or if you're from Ethiopia, you have this fermented bread, right? Maybe let's add some of that in, you know. And they're like, you know what, I really love my grandmother. Let's add some of that in, a little bit less, you know, pizza rolls.
Yeah, well, there's an idea the Second World War changed a lot of things. And before the Second World War, sauerkraut was really quite a big thing in the US. And because it was associated with being German, it was like banned, you know, like the freedom fries.
Typical Americans.
Yeah, they just said, okay,
we kick it all out the window.
We're not having that, you know, Nazi stuff. We've got to ban it, and it's not American to eat it anymore. And sadly, that's a bit of the legacy, because it was pretty big apparently in the 30s and 40s. People were making it themselves. There was, you know, it was a thing everyone could make in their house. And embracing these other ferments, as other countries have done, really important. And I think the science is now showing us that this isn't just folklore that these were healthy. There have been some really good experiments very recently. There was one done in Stanford by colleagues of mine, and just in 6 to 8 weeks, people having three to four portions of fermented foods a day dramatically reduced their inflammation levels in their body and really had a big impact on their immune system. And this is, you know, one of the first really detailed studies that's done this properly, which sort of matches the big population studies. But I think it is really important that people understand how important this is, you know, on top of a healthy plant-based diet. To have some of these foods regularly is really vital. And most of human history we've done this, and people don't realize how much fermented food, you know, we used to have before we invented the refrigerator. You know, it was the way to preserve food and keep it going and get these regular supply of microbes into us that I think probably we evolved to eat. And, you know, probably why beer was invented, you know, as at the same time as bread, you know, because we were using these yeasts and using their products, and they had this really powerful effect on our immune system. So I'm a big fan of fermenting, and I think everyone should learn how to do something about it. It also, I think, always keeps coming back to the same thing, that the best bet is to eat a diverse diet. It's to have as many different plants as you can. It's to have these fermented foods with all kinds of different bugs in them, these probiotics. It's to sort of throw everything at you, increase your sense of smell and taste, and try everything. You know, it's that variety. Variety is the spice of life, and I think that's what we keep coming back to as the way to deal with our complexity.
Let's go to the smell gym, you know.
Let's work out. Yeah.
Let's work it out. So this has been incredibly fascinating, and, you know, just to unpack this, and if you could, because I think folks are going to feel motivated to focus on improving the health of their microbiome. What are 3 things that people can do in their own lives to support a healthy microbiome?
Well, the top 3 things you can do. The first is to have a diverse series of plants on your plate every week. And we did some studies a while back with the British and American Gut Project that showed 30 plants a week is the sweet spot. It's not as tough as you think, because that includes nuts and seeds and herbs and spice mixes. And it's quite achievable if you just, you know, have a few hacks. Like, you know, I have a jar of nuts and seeds mixed that gives me about 8 to 10 plants in a go. So, you know, you can get around it. Second thing is to try and eat brightly colored plants. We haven't discussed this much, but the polyphenols in the plants, these are sort of phytochemicals, the defense chemicals that all plants have to some extent, but some have lots of them, and they tend to be really brightly colored ones, and they're ones that are also bitter. And those defense chemicals end up being really good for our gut microbes. They're like rocket fuel for your gut microbes. So that's why coffee is good for you. It's not the caffeine, it's the polyphenols in there. And that's why dark chocolate is good for you. It's why nuts are good for you. And it's why olive oil is so good for you. But also berries and other plants like that. Then fermented foods. We discussed having small amounts regular and often to boost your immune system, really important, and boost your gut health. And I think we evolved to eat them, and we've just forgotten how to do that. And try and eat as many different ones as you can. Don't just have the same yogurt every day. Mix it up. Get some of these other, I call them the 4Ks. The kefir, kombucha, kraut and kimchi. Just think of different ones you can have in small amounts. They're the top three, and I'd add in two more. One is, we haven't really discussed it, but giving your gut a rest. So time-restricted eating is actually beneficial for your gut microbes. So if you can ideally leave 14 hours when they're not working, they really respond well metabolically. And so we've done some big studies of this, looking at over 100,000 people, and generally people eating in a 10-hour window and having 14 hours not eating, most people do pretty well on that, and that helps their metabolism. And finally, cut out as much as possible ultra-processed food.
One category of foods that, strangely enough, has been found to help to reduce stress is fermented foods. Several studies are now affirming how fermented foods and probiotic bacteria can reduce stress and improve mental health. For instance, a study cited in the journal Psychiatry Research titled Fermented Foods, Neuroticism, and Social Anxiety denoted how animal and human studies show that fermented foods have the potential to reduce symptoms of anxiety. What? How? Well, a lot of this chemistry, a lot of our neurotransmitters associated with our mood are located in our gut. There's this interface between our gut bacteria and these enterochromaffin cells, enteroendocrine cells that are producing and storing the chemistry that affects our mood. And we know there's this profound gut-brain connection that has recently been detailed in a tremendous amount of peer-reviewed data. So this is what's happening. We're bringing in these friendly, complementary probiotics, and they're really helping to support that environment, because that's what it's really about, is having a healthy environment that supports a good mood. And also, of course, the reduction of stress. What are some of the most popular forms of fermented foods out there? Well, we've got obviously sauerkraut, we've got kimchi, we've got pickles. Now you got to make sure that they're actually real pickles, because with real pickles, that's going to be in the refrigerated section of the grocery store, by the way. And this is utilizing brine. So it's going to be salt, water, and it is fermented. There's a trick with the food industry where they can basically create a pseudo pickle by using vinegar. All right. So it's like making the pickle twerk its way forcefully into becoming a pickle. All right. Versus the pickle twerking its way to being fermented on its own free will. All right. We want freedom of twerk out here for our pickles, for our fermented foods. I don't know why I use that analogy, but I did. It just happened right here. So keep in mind, we want to make sure that we're going for real pickles when we're going for pickles. And also, there's a variety of different yogurts. There's varieties of also fermented breads as well. There's so many different things that different cultures around the world look to. There's fermented shark up in Iceland. They fermented shark up there. All right. It's a thing. So a variety of fermented foods can be great for our waistline, but also for what's happening with our mind, our ability to process and modulate stress. And it has a lot to do with what's happening with the gut-brain axis.
So the science is really interesting. Vinegar, it turns out, if you have a tablespoon of it in some water before a meal, you can reduce the glucose spike of that meal by up to 30%. And the insulin release by up to 20%, you can reduce it without changing what you're eating afterwards, just by harnessing the power of this molecule called acetic acid, which is in vinegar, that has a powerful effect on your glucose levels. And so in week 2, I give people lots of different ways to try out this hack for themselves. You know, it doesn't have to be just vinegar and water. Most people find that not very appealing. I love it now, but, you know, to each their own. And you can have it as tea, you can make little mocktails, you can use it as a dressing on your food. And just by adding this very small little ingredient, you can have a powerful effect on your health. And interestingly, vinegar has been used for centuries in countries like in Iran, where they just know it's a healthy thing to add. In the 18th century, vinegar tea was prescribed to people with type 1 diabetes. So culturally, we've known these things. For example, the breakfast. We've known that breakfast should not be dessert. Like, we've known breakfast should be a regular meal, but now we've lost touch with a lot of this stuff. And now, because we have the science to show us how it actually works in our body, we can decide to bring those things back, and they're really, really powerful.
Now, when you say acetic acid, it immediately makes me think about apple cider vinegar. So is that one of the vinegar choices?
So any type of vinegar works. Any type. White wine vinegar, red vinegar, balsamic, rice vinegar, cherry vinegar, whatever, and apple cider vinegar. Apple cider vinegar, or ACV, is the most popular one, but they all work the same. For a lot of people, ACV is just more palatable. They like the taste more, but you can use any vinegar you want, except avoid the very syrupy balsamic glaze, which is really not vinegar anymore. It's more like sugar with a bit of vinegar in it. So as long as you're not using that, you can use whatever you want.
So naturally producing GLP-1 is a lot about the gut bacteria. And one of the gut bacteria that has been found to be deficient and seems to improve production of GLP-1 is something called Akkermansia. So we're seeing a lot of supplementation of Akkermansia right now. And the reason Akkermansia is helpful is it secretes a protein that rehabs the gut lining, which then allows better production of GLP-1. This idea of the gut lining, right, that takes you all the way back to the earliest conversations around leaky gut, malabsorption, whatever you want to call it. But that gut lining has to be intact. And unfortunately, the other modern day sort of gift is that for the majority of people, between stress, between food quality, even between pharmaceutical medications, right, that gut lining is getting destroyed. So that's another factor that's taking down our GLP-1. So the other thing we were thinking about with food, you know, protein, yes, fiber, yes, but what's going to give us more microbial diversity? What can naturally increase something like Akkermansia or the other bacteria that are involved in this equation, like lactobacillus, bifidobacteria, and more? And that's where in 2014, it seems like forever ago, I wrote a book, The 21-Day Belly Fix, and we talked a lot about the importance of the gut and the gut microbiome. And one of the ways to increase something like Akkermansia or lactobacillus or bifidobacteria ties you definitely back to protein and fiber, but also encourages a lot of fermented foods in the diet. So taking in things like, you know, kefir or bone broth, or eating sourdough bread over a regular bread, but really fermented sourdough bread, not something sitting on the grocery store shelf. You know, I had a question on social the other day about pickles and pickle juice. Well, that's fermented too, you know. So some of these fermented products are providing some of this bacteria that's necessary for adequate production of GLP-1. So after, I always say you graduate, first you kind of get the protein part down, like, okay, am I getting the protein? And, you know, are my numbers right? Am I getting the intervals right? Then you start looking at fiber critically. And quite honestly, nobody's getting enough fiber. I have, you know, men and women coming in every day, like, I eat all these salads. Salads are actually very low fiber unless you're consciously trying to add the right fruits and vegetables to it, right? Better choice than maybe pasta or bread, but still not getting the fiber that's needed today to help you metabolize and to produce GLP-1. And so once you kind of graduate from that, then moving on and, hey, am I getting at least maybe 3 to 5 servings of fermented foods in my diet every day? That's kind of the next level of diving into food so that you can manage those bacteria that are involved in GLP-1 signaling. super important.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
How many people do you think are alive today who are 100 years old or older?
My guess would be in the ballpark of maybe 25,000.
The answer is 722,000 people are age 100 or older today.